Page 42. Mayak's eyelids fluttered. The black lashes parted, then framed her wide eyes like ferns around a pool. She had eaten, slept for many hours, and the dull, tired feeling of starvation was gone. She felt bright and very much alive. Rolling to her stomach, she propped herself on her elbows and then reached into her pot to eat. She ate a lot. The foods in her pot lowered drastically. When but 2 meals remained, she made up her mind to tell Armorak she wanted a whole shank of caribou. Wolves did bring food to their dens. Capagoon had seen them walk along miles in spring, with legs and ribs for the mothers who stayed in the ground with their pups for almost 10 days after birth. Well, she had no puppies to induce Armorak to feed her, so she pondered again. Cap again had once told her of a wolf who was wounded by the wolves of the caribou. He limped into a rock cave and laid down to recover. Every night his leader trotted over the snow, bringing him meat until he was well and could rejoin the pack. Mayaks did not suffer a wound, but it seemed to her that in order to be fed by the wolves, one had to be helpless. If that's the case, she said to herself, I should be buried in food. I'm helpless enough. I cannot feel a caribou or catch a bird, and I'm lost besides. She thrust her head out the door. Armorak, I'm helpless, she cried. The chilly air tingled her nose, and she noticed that the cotton grasses by the pond were seeding out into white puffs. This was worrisome, for they marked the coming of autumn, the snows and the whiteouts. Whiteouts could be dangerous. When the cotton grass heads were gone, the winds would lift the snow from the ground to the air, and she would not be able to see her feet. She would be imprisoned wherever she stood, maybe for days, maybe till death. Armorak hollered the long note to assemble. Silver and Nails barked a brief coming, and it was the beginning of a new day for Mayaks and the wolves. Although the clocks in Barrow would say it was time to get ready for bed, she was getting up, for she was on wolf time. Since there was no darkness to hamper her vision, night was as good as time to work as day, and much better if you were a wolf girl. Rehearsing whimpers and groveling positions as she climbed to her lookout, she got ready to tell Armorak how helpless she was in his own language. He was awake, lying on his side, watching Sister's paw twitch as she slept. He got up and licked the restless sleeper as if to say, all's well. The paw relaxed. Mayaks whimpered and twisted her head appealingly. Armorak shot her a glance and wagged his tail as if to say, hello, not, I'm helpless. Suddenly his head lifted, his ears went up, and Armorak sniffed the wind. Mayaks sniffed the wind and smelled nothing, although Armorak was on his feet now, electric with the airborne message. He snapped his hunters to attention and led them down the slope and off into the tundra. Jello stayed home with the pups. The pack moved in single file almost to the horizon, then swerved and came back. Shading her eyes, Mayaks finally saw what the wind had told Armorak. A herd of caribou were passing through. She held her breath as the hunters sped towards a large buck. The animal opened his stride and gracefully gained around. He could so easily outrun the wolves that Armorak let him go and trotted toward another. This one, too, outdistanced the pack, and Armorak swerved and tested another. Just as Mayaks was wondering how the wolves ever caught anything, Armorak put on full speed and bore down on a third. This animal could not outrun him, and when Armorak attacked, he turned and struck with his powerful hooves. Like a bouncing ball, the leader sprang away. Nails and Silver fanned out to either side of the beast, then veered and closed in. The caribou bellowed, pressed back his ears, zigzagged over a frost heave, then disappeared from sight. They're chasing the weakest, Mayaks said in astonishment. It's just like Capagoon said. Wolves take the old and sick. She looked from the empty tundra to the busy den site. Capu was staring at her. His eyes narrowed, his ears thrown forced aggressively. Now why are you so hostile? She asked. Then looked at her feet and legs. Eely, Eely. She dropped to all fours and smiled apologetically. Aye, Capu. You've never seen a man in all your life. What is it that tells you to beware? Some spirit of your ancestors that still dwells in your body? She gave the great whine, and Capu pressed down his ears, snatched up a bone, and brought it over to her. She grabbed it. He tugged. She pulled. He growled. She giggled. And Jello called Capu home. He cocked an ear, rolled his eyes, and ignored the babysitter. "You're naughty," she said, and covered a grin with her hand. "Martha would scold me for that." Kapu dropped the bone. She leaned down, picked it up with her teeth, and tried to run on all fours. She had barely begun to move away when Kapu leaped on her back and took her bare back in his teeth. She started to scream, checked herself, and closing her eyes, waited for the teeth to pierce the skin. They did not even bruise, so controlled was this grip that said, "Drop the bone." She let it go, and in one swish, Kapu leaned to the ground and snatched it. As she started after him, something struck her boot, and she looked around to see Zit, Zat, and Sister at her heels. Zing charged up the knoll, hit her arm with great force, and knocked her to the ground. She growled, flashed her teeth, and narrowed her eyes. Kapu dropped the bone and lay down. Zing backed up, and for a moment not a puppy moved. "Phew," she smiled. That did it. Too late she remembered that such a smile was an apology. A sort of, "I didn't mean it." And before she could growl, all 5 little wolves jumped on her again. "Stop!" She was angry. They sensed it and backed away. "Shoo! Go!" She waved her arm above her head, and the threatening pose spoke louder than all her words. Drooping their tails, glancing warily at her, they trotted away, all but Kapu. He licked her cheek. Dear Kapu. She was about to stroke his head when he picked up the bone and carried it back to the den. But he was not done with play. He never was. Kapu was tireless. Diving into a tunnel, he came out on the other side and landed on Jello's tail. When Mayak saw this, she sat back on her heels. Open-ended tunnels reminded her of something. In the spring, wolf packs stay at a nursery den where the pups are born deep in the earth at the end of long tunnels. When the pups are about 6 weeks old and big enough to walk and run, the leaders move the entire group to a summer den. These were mere shelters for the pups and are open at 2 ends. For a few weeks, the packs stay at this den. Then they leave and they take up the nomadic winter life of the wolf. The cold chill of fear ran up Mayak's spine. The wolves would soon depart. Then what would she do? She could not follow them. They often ran 50 miles in a night and slept in different spots each day. Her hands trembled as she pressed them together to make them stop, for Kapagoon had taught her that fear can so cripple a person that he cannot think or act. Already she was too scared to crawl. "Change your ways when fear seizes," he had said, "for it usually means you are doing something wrong." She knew what it was. She should not depend upon the wolves for survival. She must go on her own. Instantly, she felt relieved. Her legs moved, her hands stopped shaking, and she remembered that when Kapagoon was a boy, he had told her he made snares of rawhide and caught little birds. "Buntings, beware!" She shouted and slid down to her camp. Stepping out of her pants, she slipped off her tights and cut a swath of cloth from the hip with her ulo. She tore the cloth into small strips, then ate some stew, then started off to hunt birds. Every so often, she tied a bit of red cloth to a clump of grass or around a conspicuous stone. If she was going to hunt in this confusing land, she must leave a trail to lead her home. She could not smell her way back as the wolves did. As she tied the first piece of cloth to a bent siege, she looked down on a small pile of droppings. "Ely," she said, "a bird roost. Someone sleeps here every night." Quickly, she took the thongs from her boots, made a noose, and placed it under the siege. Holding the pole note, she moved back as far as she could and lay down to await the return of the bird. The sun slid slowly down the sky, hung still for a moment, then started up again. It was midnight. A flock of swift-flying Arctic terns darted overhead, and one by one dropped into the grasses. Ruddy turnstones called sleepily from their scattered roosts. The sandpipers whistled. The creatures of the tundra were going to sleep, as they did also at noon in the constant daylight. Each called from his roost, all but the little bird of the siege. It had not come back. A bird chirped 3 feet from her face, and Mayax rolled her eyes to the left. A bunting on a grass blade tucked its bill into the feathers on its back, fluffed, and went to sleep. Where, she asked, was the bird? Had it been killed by a fox or a weasel? She was about to get on her feet and hunt elsewhere, but she remembered that Kapagoon never gave up. Sometimes he would stand motionless for 5 hours at a seal-breathing hole in the ice, waiting for a seal to come up for a breath. She must wait too. The sun moved on around the sky, and when it was directly behind her, the sleeping bunting lifted its head and chirped. It hopped to a higher blade of grass, preened, and sang its morning song. The sleep was over. Her bird had not come back. Suddenly a shadow passed. A snowy owl, white wings folded in a pluming dive, threw out his feathered feet and struck the little gray bunting. The owl bounced up and came down almost on Mayak's outstretched hand. The bird caught in its foot. Her first instinct was to pounce on the owl, but she instantly thought better of that. Even if she could catch him, she would have his powerful claws and beak to contend with, and she knew what damage they could do. Besides, she had a better idea, to lie still and watch where he flew. Perhaps he had owlets in the nest, for those little birds took almost 6 weeks to get their wings. If there were owlets, there would also be food, lots of it, for the male owls are constantly bringing food to the young. Once she had counted 80 lemmings piled in the nest of a snowy owl. So close was the upik, the white owl of the north, that she could see the clove markings on its wings and the dense white feathers that covered its legs and feet. His large eyes were pixelish, and he looked like a funny little Eskimo in white parka and maklas. The wind stirred the wolverine trim on Mayak's hood, and the owl turned its gleaming eyes upon her. She tried not to blink and belie the life in her stone-still body, but he was suspicious. He turned his head almost upside down to get a more acute focus on her. Then, unwinding swiftly, he lifted his body and sped off. His wings arched deeply as he steered into the wind and shot like a bullet toward the sun. As Mayax rolled into a sitting position, the owl scooped his wings up, braked, and dropped into an exceptionally large frost heave. He left the bird and flew out over the tundra, screaming the demonic call of the hunting ukpik.